Hello everyone, if you enjoy this video, please hit that like button, drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe. I'm on a mission to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support means the world to me, and let's get started. On August 15, 1769, in the sweltering heat of the Mediterranean summer, a child was born on a rugged island that seemed an unlikely launching pad for global fame. Corsica, a mountainous place fringed with olive groves and battered by sea winds, was a land of fiercely independent people who had spent centuries resisting outsiders. Its very soil was mixed with stories of defiance: Genoese soldiers, bandits hiding in the crags, and local patriots dreaming of freedom. Into this world of restless resistance came Napoleon Bonaparte, the boy who would one day be known as Napoleon Bonaparte. His birthplace, Ajaccio, was no bustling capital but a modest town, nestled on a bay that smelled of salt and wild herbs. The Bonaparte house was not palatial but respectable, a tall building with whitewashed walls and wooden shutters that creaked in the wind. His family belonged to the minor nobility, enough status to carry pride but not enough wealth to bring comfort. It meant they had titles, but little money. That contradiction, honor without riches, shaped Napoleon's earliest sense of the world. You could be noble yet still feel like a beggar knocking at history's door. Napoleon's father, Carlo Bonaparte, was a man who walked the thin line between ambition and opportunism. Educated and eloquent, he saw himself as part of Corsica's struggle for independence. For years, he was a supporter of Pasquale Paoli, the great Corsican patriot who had led the island in revolt against the Genoese. But history turned fast. In 1768, just 1 year before Napoleon's birth, the Genoese sold Corsica to France, a transaction that enraged many Corsicans but also sealed the island's fate. Carlo, pragmatic if not entirely loyal, switched sides when resistance became futile. He took positions under the new French administration, trying to climb whatever ladder was available. To some, he was a traitor; to others, simply a survivor. His wife, Letizia Ramolino, was the opposite: stern, disciplined, and iron-willed. Pregnant with Napoleon during the turbulence of Corsica's handover to France, she supposedly rode on horseback across rough terrain while carrying him. People would later say that the boy inherited her toughness, her refusal to break under hardship. Letizia ran her household like a general: discipline, faith, frugality. She bore 13 children, though not all survived infancy. Napoleon grew up in this crowded, noisy, yet tightly controlled family environment, where money was scarce but ambition ran high. Corsica itself shaped him as much as his parents did. Imagine growing up in a place where nearly every family had a tale of resistance, where men still carried vendettas, and where honor was defended with knives as much as with words. The Corsicans were proud, quick to anger, and fiercely protective of their traditions. They valued strength, cunning, and an ability to endure hardship. For a boy like Napoleon, this atmosphere was like a school before any classroom ever claimed him. He learned early the language of pride and defiance, even as the political realities forced his father into cooperation with the French. Napoleon never lost that sense of being an outsider. Even when he would later stand crowned as Emperor of France, critics mocked him as the Corsican, a provincial, a foreigner with a rough accent. That sting of otherness began in childhood, when he was caught between two identities: Corsican by blood, French by necessity. His early letters often show him torn between adoring Paoli, the Corsican freedom fighter, and recognizing that France, the conqueror, was also his ticket to opportunity. It was a contradiction that burned in him, fueling both resentment and ambition. By all accounts, young Napoleon was not the kind of child who blended easily. Small in stature, wary, and with a sharp tongue, he was quick to fight with his peers. Stories tell of him leading make-believe battles with other boys, commanding troops of friends with wooden swords and improvised flags. Yet there was more than just playfulness there. Even at that age, he hated to lose. If a game didn't go his way, he argued, bullied, or schemed until he came out on top. His teachers later recalled his stubbornness, that sense of relentless willpower. At home, he devoured books. history fascinated him. While other boys might have chased animals or lazed by the sea, Napoleon pored over accounts of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, and Plutarch's lives. Those stories became part of his bloodstream, shaping his imagination. He wasn't just a Corsican boy anymore, he was a Corsican boy dreaming of empires. The Bonapartes were not rich, and their noble title often felt hollow. Carlos struggled to provide for his family, even while working within the French system. But fortune, or at least clever maneuvering, opened a path. He secured French scholarships for his children. Napoleon was sent to mainland France at the age of 9, a boy from a rugged island thrown into the polished, often snobbish world of continental aristocracy. Imagine it, a boy with a thick Corsican accent, mocked for his provincial manners, trying to fit in at French schools where wealthier children looked down their noses at him. He was ridiculed as the little Corsican, or even the barbarian. That sting cut deep, but instead of crushing him, it hardened him. He doubled down on study, determined to outshine those who mocked him. If he couldn't beat them in polish, he would beat them in brains, and later, on the battlefield. This sense of being underestimated became a lifelong weapon for Napoleon. Again and again, he would face doubters who thought him too small, too foreign, or too audacious. And again, he would prove them wrong, often spectacularly. Though Napoleon eventually embraced his role as French officer and later as ruler, the Corsican streak never left him. In his early years in France, he often wrote home expressing nostalgia for the island. He admired Paoli, sometimes writing in glowing terms about Corsican independence, even while serving France. His letters were conflicted, part nationalist, part pragmatic. This duality never fully resolved. The Corsican soil had given him toughness, but the French system gave him the tools to rise. Without both, there would be no Napoleon as we remember him. Looking back, it's tempting to see signs of greatness already present in that boy running through the streets of Ajaccio or sulking in a French classroom. Was he destined, from the beginning, for power? Perhaps destiny is too romantic a word. More likely, he was shaped by the collision of circumstances, a fiercely proud islander, born at the very moment his homeland was absorbed into a great empire, thrust into a foreign culture that mocked him, yet fueled by stories of past conquerors. He was not born to a throne but to the restless energy of contradiction, Corsican and French, noble and poor, mocked and admired. The world would not have cared about another Corsican boy. But Napoleon carried that early chip on his shoulder like a sword, ready to prove himself. And as history shows, there's nothing more dangerous than a man who has something to prove. When Napoleon first left Corsica for mainland France, he was just 9 years old. 9. Think about that, a boy barely taller than the musket stacked in the corner of a garrison yard, suddenly uprooted from his noisy Corsican home and sent to live among strangers who spoke a more polished French than he did. His family name, Bonaparte, still rang with Italian Corsican sounds, not the clipped syllables of Parisian nobility. And he carried with him not only the pride of Corsica but also the sting of poverty. He was noble, yes, but the kind of noble that couldn't always afford new shoes. That contradiction followed him into every classroom. His first stop was Autun, a town in Burgundy, where he was enrolled to brush up on his French before advancing to military training. It was here he had to polish away some of his Corsican edges. He arrived speaking Italian and Corsican dialects more fluently than French, and his accent stuck out like a sore thumb. Children teased him for it. The teachers tried to smooth his rough manners. But Napoleon had something better than manners: stubbornness. He applied himself to language the way a soldier sharpens his blade, with persistence and no small amount of resentment. In Autun, he also learned that being an outsider could be both a curse and a shield. The French boys laughed at him, but their laughter only hardened him. He retreated into books, into numbers, into the one place where ridicule couldn't touch him: study. Soon enough, Napoleon was transferred to the Royal Military School at Brienne-le-Château. Now the real test began. Imagine a place filled with sons of wealthier nobles, polished young men in training who already carried themselves like they belonged to the officer class. And then there was Napoleon, small, dark-haired, with a Corsican accent thick enough to cut with a knife. The other boys noticed, and they made sure he knew he wasn't one of them. They nicknamed him the Little Corsican, mocking his origins, his awkward French, and even his modest clothes. In a world where appearances mattered, Napoleon's second-hand dignity looked shabby. But if they thought their scorn would break him, they misjudged. Napoleon didn't bend, he bristled. He answered insults with sharper ones, fists if need be, and when that wasn't enough, he turned to his books with a vengeance. If he couldn't outshine them socially, he would outshine them intellectually. And he did. At Brienne, Napoleon discovered the subject that would become his secret weapon, mathematics. He had a natural talent for numbers, for geometry, for the cold logic of lines and angles. Artillery, the rising star of 18th-century warfare, required exactly that kind of mind. While cavalry depended on aristocratic elegance and infantry on brute courage, artillery was the science of war, the place where precision mattered more than pedigree. Napoleon excelled in it. His teachers noticed. Here was a boy who could calculate trajectories, plan fortifications, and think like an engineer, all before his voice had fully settled into adulthood. He wasn't just learning, he was preparing. The day would come when those calculations would decide battles, when his grasp of terrain and timing would make him more than just another officer. But talent didn't erase loneliness. Napoleon's years at Brienne were marked by a kind of self-imposed isolation. He had a few acquaintances, but no real friends. He preferred to walk alone in the gardens, daydreaming about history's great men, Alexander, Caesar, Hannibal. He read Plutarch's Lives with the fervor of someone searching for a map of destiny. While the other boys chased games or flirted with ease, Napoleon kept to himself, scribbling notes, filling his head with strategies and ambitions far beyond his years. There's a story, perhaps embellished, but telling nonetheless, that when other boys at Brienne played snowball fights, Napoleon turned them into military campaigns. He organized teams, built fortifications, and laid out strategies. Snowballs became artillery. Children became soldiers. And, of course, Napoleon insisted on commanding. Even in play, he sought control, structure, and victory. The ridicule he endured carved something permanent into him. He learned early to mask hurt with disdain, to meet scorn with cold superiority. That defensive pride never left him. Throughout his life, he would remain hypersensitive to slights, mock his accent, his origins, or his legitimacy, and you would feel his fury. Yet that same sensitivity also fueled him. Being underestimated was his favorite challenge. Nothing delighted him more than proving people wrong. It's worth pausing here. Had Napoleon been born into comfort, had he been accepted easily among his peers, would he have developed that same fierce drive? Probably not. It was precisely because he was the outsider, the boy who didn't fit, the Corsican mocked by French aristocrats, that he built the armor of willpower. The emperor was born in those lonely classrooms, long before the throne was even imaginable. In 1784, Napoleon's diligence paid off. He was admitted to the École Militaire in Paris, the elite academy that turned young men into officers for the French army. To get there, he had to compete against sons of wealthier families. His father's connections and his own brilliance in mathematics secured him the spot. Paris was dazzling compared to Brienne. The capital brimmed with carriages, cafés, and chatter about politics. But Napoleon remained, in essence, the awkward outsider. His accent hadn't softened. His Corsican pride hadn't dimmed. He still looked shabby compared to richer cadets. But at École Militaire, he had one advantage: he was focused. While others dallied, he studied. He completed the program in just a year, half the usual time, graduating at 16 as a second lieutenant of artillery. Think of that, a Corsican boy who had once stumbled over French verbs now wore the uniform of a French officer. It was a triumph, though a modest one. He was still poor. His pay was meager. But he had a commission, a place in the army, and a foothold in the very world that had once mocked him. His first postings were in garrisons, Valence, Auxonne, quiet towns where soldiers drilled and officers lived on limited pay. Here, Napoleon read endlessly, filling notebooks with reflections on history, philosophy, and war. He also began writing essays, some of them political, many of them fiery. In one, he railed against the French presence in Corsica, still nursing his homeland's wound. In another, he pondered the future of nations and leaders. He was sharpening not just his military mind but also his political voice. And yet, he remained that awkward, solitary figure. He wasn't popular among his fellow officers. His Corsican brusqueness and his sharp tongue rubbed people the wrong way. But he didn't care. Or perhaps he cared too much and masked it with arrogance. Either way, he continued to climb, step by step. Looking back, it's striking how much of Napoleon's future character was already visible in those early years: the solitary ambition, the quick temper, the obsession with study, the ability to see war as geometry and politics as theater. Above all, the refusal to accept limits. He was still just a boy in a uniform, mocked as the Corsican, ignored by Parisian society. But he carried with him a chip on his shoulder the size of an empire. And as history would soon find out, an outsider with something to prove can be far more dangerous than a man already content with his place in the world. By the late 1780s, the world around Napoleon was quivering like a bridge under strain. France wasn't just restless, it was breaking. Years of debt, famine, and privilege piled high until, finally, the whole system collapsed. In 1789, the revolution began. To some, it was liberty's dawn. To others, it was chaos unchained. To Napoleon Bonaparte, it was opportunity. He was still a young officer then, stationed in garrisons, earning little, and writing long letters to his family back in Corsica. He read voraciously about the revolution as it unfolded: Louis XVI forced to Paris, nobles fleeing abroad, the guillotine soon to become France's most infamous machine. His pen brimmed with commentary, some of it radical, some of it confused. He was searching for his place in a nation tearing itself apart. Corsica was still in his blood. Pasquale Paoli, the island's great patriot, had returned from exile in Britain and was again leading Corsican independence. Young Napoleon idolized him, at first. He even tried to support Paoli's efforts. But the alliance didn't last. Paoli mistrusted the Bonapartes, especially Carlo, who had bent toward French authority. Napoleon himself, though Corsican in heart, was now too tied to France through his military career. He and Paoli clashed bitterly, and Napoleon's family had to flee Corsica when the independence movement turned against them. This exile hardened him further. Corsica, the homeland he had once dreamed of liberating, was gone to him now. If he couldn't be Paoli's successor on the island, he would be something greater in France. Destiny had nudged him across the sea, away from a provincial stage toward the vast theater of Europe. The revolution had gutted the old officer class. Nobles fled, executed, or disgraced left gaps everywhere in the French army. Ambitious men of lower birth could rise, if they had the talent and the nerve. Napoleon had both. The artillery branch, in particular, offered openings. Artillery was brains over bloodlines, math over manners. Still, Napoleon's rise wasn't instant. He spent years drifting on half-pay, his career stalled, his ambitions trapped in a France where political winds shifted weekly. He tried his hand at writing revolutionary pamphlets, calling for democracy and railing against tyranny. He wasn't above a little contradiction, one moment praising freedom, the next justifying harsh crackdowns. But that was the revolution itself, wild, unstable, and inconsistent. Then came 1793, and with it, Toulon. France was at war with Britain and Spain. The revolution's enemies circled like vultures. Inside France, royalists and rebels flared up in civil war. Toulon, a key port on the Mediterranean, rose in revolt and invited the British Navy to occupy it. If Toulon stayed in enemy hands, France risked losing the entire south coast. The French army rushed to retake the city, but the siege dragged on. Artillery was disorganized. Plans faltered. Enter a young captain of artillery named Napoleon Bonaparte. He was just 24. Thin, intense, with eyes that seemed to see more than others did. He proposed a plan: concentrate fire on the British fleet in the harbor, drive them out, and force the city to collapse. It was bold, practical, and brilliant. His superiors, some skeptical, some desperate, gave him a chance. Napoleon threw himself into the task. He directed batteries, oversaw fortifications, and even took part in combat. He was everywhere, tireless, obsessed. The soldiers noticed his energy. He wasn't just a theorist with a pen, he was in the mud with them, barking orders, taking risks. The plan worked. The concentrated artillery fire forced the British fleet to withdraw. Without naval support, Toulon fell. It was a decisive victory for the Republic, and the moment Napoleon's name first leapt from obscurity into military fame. But Toulon wasn't just triumph. It was blood. When the city surrendered, brutal reprisals followed. Thousands of royalists and rebels were killed or imprisoned. Napoleon had seen war before, but now he tasted the revolution's ruthless edge. Victory meant survival. Mercy was rare. Still, the reward for success was swift. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general at 24. From a half-pay, overlooked officer, he had become a man noticed by Paris. Reports praised his skill, his daring, his effectiveness. His accent and origins mattered less now, results spoke louder than lineage. The revolution didn't calm after Toulon. In Paris, power shifted from Jacobins to moderates, from Robespierre's reign of terror to the Directory. Napoleon, like many officers, had to navigate treacherous politics. One wrong allegiance could mean the guillotine. He kept his head low, wrote cautiously, and waited. Then, in October 1795, chaos struck Paris. Royalist mobs rose against the Directory, threatening to topple the fragile government. Paris needed saving. Who did they call? A certain young general known for his artillery skill. Napoleon deployed cannons at key streets and, when the mob charged, unleashed volleys of grapeshot, canisters filled with iron balls that ripped through crowds like a giant shotgun. The rebellion melted under the fire. Paris was secured. It was ruthless, yes, but effective. And it cemented his reputation. One politician summed it up with a phrase that stuck: Napoleon had saved the Republic with a whiff of grapeshot. From that moment, the Directory knew his worth. He was given command of the Army of Italy, a struggling, half-starved force on the frontier. To some, it looked like an unglamorous posting. To Napoleon, it was the perfect stage. Here was his chance to prove that his brilliance at Toulon and Paris wasn't a fluke, that he could command not just guns but men, not just sieges but whole campaigns. The revolution had opened the door. Corsica was behind him, poverty was behind him, and France, turbulent, bloody, unstable France, was giving him the opportunity of a lifetime. And Napoleon Bonaparte had no intention of letting it close. When Napoleon Bonaparte received command of the Army of Italy in early 1796, few in Paris expected miracles. In fact, many expected failure. The army was a ragtag mess, half-starved, ill-equipped, and demoralized after years of neglect. Soldiers went without shoes, officers went unpaid. Supplies were so scarce that men joked they were fighting more hunger than Austrians. To most, the Italian front was a sideshow, far less glamorous than the Rhine campaigns. Sending a 26-year-old general there looked more like an insult than an opportunity. But for Napoleon, it was the perfect stage. He was thin, pale, and unimpressive in appearance when he arrived. One officer sneered, "Is this runt the general?" Napoleon was small, yes, but he carried himself with an intensity that filled the room. Within days, he made it clear that this runt intended to be obeyed. He spoke to the soldiers not as a distant aristocrat, but as one of them. "I will lead you into the most fertile plains in the world," he promised. "There you will find honor, glory, and riches." It wasn't just rhetoric, it was what desperate men needed to hear. They were hungry, shoeless, and tired of being ignored by Paris. Here was a general who didn't drone about politics but promised loot, glory, and bread. The soldiers cheered him. For the first time in months, they believed. Napoleon's leadership style was unlike anything the French armies had seen. He didn't sit back and issue distant orders. He rode among the men, spoke to them directly, remembered names, and made himself visible in danger. He didn't just command, he inspired. And unlike many generals of the era, Napoleon fought fast. He hated delays, despised hesitation. His motto could have been, "Strike first, strike hard, keep moving." He used speed and surprise as weapons, turning weakness into advantage. The Austrians and their allies, the Piedmontese, thought they could crush this shabby French army easily. But Napoleon struck first. In April 1796, he launched a whirlwind of attacks: Montenat, Millesimo, Dago. He split enemy forces apart, defeated them piecemeal, and outmaneuvered generals twice his age. It was chess at lightning speed. While the Austrians lumbered, Napoleon danced. He moved his troops quickly over mountain passes, striking where least expected. "In war, the moral is to the physical as 3-1, he later said. And in Italy, he proved it. His men, fired with confidence and speed, outclassed better supplied enemies. By the end of April, Piedmont had had enough. The kingdom sued for peace, abandoning its Austrian allies. Napoleon had broken one opponent in weeks, a feat that shocked Europe. He turned next to the Austrians, pushing them back toward the north. Paris began to pay attention. Dispatches from Italy painted a picture of a young commander reshaping the war. Newspapers glorified him. The name Bonaparte spread beyond military circles into the wider imagination of France. Then came the Battle of Lodi in May 1796. The Austrians held a bridge over the Adda River, their cannon sweeping the span. Crossing looked suicidal. But Napoleon decided to push anyway. He ordered a frontal assault, sending grenadiers across under murderous fire. The French staggered, bled, but kept coming. Napoleon himself ran up to the bridge, waving flags, urging them on. The Austrians broke. The French stormed across. Victory was theirs. The soldiers were electrified. They began calling Napoleon Le Petit Caporal, the Little Corporal. The nickname stuck, and it mattered. It meant they saw him not as a distant general but as one of them, a comrade who shared their risks. Trust was sealed in blood on that bridge. Later in life, Napoleon would downplay Lodi as a small battle. But in his heart, he admitted, "At Lodi, I first believed myself a man of destiny." From there, it was relentless. Castiglione, Arcole, Rivoli, names that became synonymous with brilliance. Again and again, Napoleon used speed, deception, and concentration of force to smash larger armies. He kept his troops moving so fast that enemies couldn't coordinate. He seemed everywhere at once. At Arcole, in November 1796, he famously seized a flag and tried to rally his men across another deadly bridge. Accounts say he was nearly killed, dragged into the mud, but refused to retreat. Whether embellished or not, the story spread like wildfire. Bonaparte was fearless. By January 1797, the Austrians were broken. The once shabby army of Italy had marched to glory, carrying wagon loads of captured treasure and living off the fertile plains their general had promised. But Napoleon wasn't just a soldier, he was already showing signs of a politician. After his victories, he negotiated directly with enemy states, often without consulting Paris. He seized art, gold, and supplies, sending them back to France. Masterpieces from Italy, statues, paintings, were carted off to the Louvre. To his men, this was proof of their general's promise: war paid. To the Directory in Paris, it was both thrilling and unsettling. Here was a general who not only won battles but acted like an independent statesman. He was too useful to rein in, but already, some worried about how much power he was gathering. By the end of the Italian campaign, Napoleon was no longer an obscure Corsican officer. He was a national hero. The newspapers adored him, painting him as France's savior, the man who brought glory back to the Republic. His marriage to Josephine de Beauharnais, widow of a guillotined aristocrat, tied him to influential Parisian circles. In just 1 year, he had transformed himself from a mocked outsider into the most talked-about general in France. Italy had been his proving ground, and he had passed the test spectacularly. And for Napoleon, this was only the beginning. By 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte was the brightest star in France. He was young, victorious, adored by his soldiers, and admired by the public. The Directory, the five-man government running the country, saw him with mixed feelings: pride in his victories, fear of his ambition. A man that popular, that successful, could easily turn his cannons on Paris instead of foreign enemies. So, what do you do with a dangerous young general who might threaten your power? You send him far away. France was still locked in struggle with Britain, its eternal rival. Directly invading Britain seemed impossible. Her navy ruled the seas. But if Britain couldn't be struck at home, she could be weakened abroad. Egypt, the jewel of the Ottoman Empire's neglected provinces, lay on the path to India, Britain's richest possession. Control Egypt, and perhaps you could disrupt British trade and even threaten the link to India. The plan was bold, exotic, and half-mad. But Napoleon loved it. He had already conquered Italy. Why not Egypt next? Why not strike at Britain's empire through the desert sands? Beyond strategy, there was romance in it. He dreamed of following in the footsteps of Alexander the Great, leading a modern crusade into the East. The Directory agreed. Let him go. Better to have him chasing pyramids than politics in Paris. In May 1798, Napoleon set sail with a vast armada, hundreds of ships, 35,000 soldiers, and, astonishingly, 167 scientists, scholars, and engineers. This was no ordinary campaign. It was part invasion, part research expedition. Historians, mathematicians, linguists, and botanists crowded the ships, hauling equipment, notebooks, and printing presses. Napoleon wanted to conquer, but he also wanted to study, to catalogue, to leave his mark on history not just through battles but through knowledge. This blend of war and science was unique. The scientists would go on to make remarkable discoveries, most famously the Rosetta Stone, which eventually unlocked the mystery of Egyptian hieroglyphs. In some ways, the expedition was as much about creating Napoleon's image as a modern Alexander as it was about defeating Britain. On the way, the French Armada stopped at Malta, stronghold of the Knights of St. John. The island fortress, considered impregnable, fell in a matter of days. Napoleon reorganized its government, seized its treasures, and sailed on. His reputation as an unstoppable force only grew. In July, the French army landed near Alexandria. The heat was suffocating, the sun merciless. The soldiers, clad in heavy European uniforms, staggered in the desert climate. But Napoleon pushed them forward. Soldiers, he proclaimed, pointing toward the pyramids in the distance, 40 centuries look down upon you. It was a line designed for eternity. He knew how to wrap battle in grandeur, how to turn a campaign into myth. At the Battle of the Pyramids, the French met the Mamluks, Egypt's ruling warrior caste. The Mamluks were fierce horsemen, charging with sabers flashing. But Napoleon's squares of infantry, bristling with bayonets and backed by artillery, tore through them. It was modern discipline against medieval cavalry. The result was decisive. Egypt was France's. While Napoleon marched, his scholars worked. They studied ancient ruins, mapped the Nile, and wrote volumes on Egypt's history, plants, and animals. Printing presses churned out bulletins in Arabic, attempting to persuade locals that the French had come as liberators, friends of Islam. Napoleon even quoted the Quran in proclamations. It was part propaganda, part wishful thinking. The Egyptians remained suspicious, and revolts flared. Still, the expedition left a lasting scientific legacy. The Description de l'Égypte, the massive series of publications produced by Napoleon's scholars, became one of the great intellectual achievements of the era. Ironically, even in failure, Napoleon's Egyptian dream enriched the world's knowledge. But then came catastrophe. In August 1798, the French fleet, anchored in Aboukir Bay near Alexandria, was caught by the British under Admiral Horatio Nelson. In a furious battle, the Battle of the Nile, the French navy was annihilated. Ships exploded, thousands died, and the survivors were bottled up in Egypt. Napoleon and his army were stranded. Cut off from France, supplies, and reinforcements, they were suddenly invaders marooned in a hostile land. The campaign dragged on. Napoleon led his men into Syria in 1799, hoping to strike at British positions, but disease, supply shortages, and stubborn resistance turned the march into misery. At Acre, his siege failed, and for the first time, Napoleon tasted real defeat. His men, racked by plague, stumbled back into Egypt. Back in Cairo, rebellions flared. The French crushed them brutally, but the dream of liberating Egypt soured into a grim occupation. The soldiers who had marched under the shadow of pyramids now trudged through sand, hungry and sick, unsure why they were there. By late 1799, Napoleon knew the Egyptian adventure was doomed. News from France reached him: political chaos, military defeats, the Directory wobbling on the edge of collapse. Here was his chance. France was weak. He was strong. So Napoleon did something astonishing: he abandoned his army. In August 1799, he slipped away with a handful of ships, leaving thousands of soldiers stranded in Egypt. His gamble had failed, but he was determined not to let failure define him. If he could seize power in France, all else could be rewritten. The Egyptian expedition was, militarily, a disaster. The army eventually surrendered years later, their long ordeal ending in humiliation. But Napoleon's image? Somehow, it survived. He spun the campaign into a tale of daring, of science, of battles under ancient pyramids. He portrayed himself not as a man defeated but as a visionary reaching beyond Europe. And France, weary of the Directory, was ready to believe him. Egypt had been his gamble, and though he lost on the battlefield, he won something greater: the aura of a man too big for generals, too bold for borders, too destined for failure to matter. The stage was set. His next act would not be in the desert but in the very heart of Paris. By the autumn of 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte was back in France, arriving quietly after slipping away from Egypt. His army was still stranded in the sands of the Nile, abandoned to its fate, but Napoleon had other priorities. France was crumbling. The Directory, that shaky five-man government, had bled public trust dry. Inflation ran wild, bread was scarce, enemies pressed on the frontiers, and corruption spread like rot through the state. France had survived the terror, but it now stumbled under mismanagement and fatigue. Napoleon saw the weakness instantly. He was only 30, but already a household name. Victories in Italy had made him a hero, even his Egyptian disaster was half forgotten thanks to his careful propaganda. Newspapers still printed his bulletins, glorifying him as a man of destiny. And Paris buzzed with one question: if anyone could save France, wasn't it Bonaparte? When Napoleon stepped ashore at Frejus in October, the reception was electric. Crowds swarmed him. The government hadn't even expected him. he had essentially abandoned his command without permission, but no one seemed to care. In Paris, he was welcomed as if he had conquered the East itself. For a country tired of politicians, a victorious general looked like salvation. He played the part carefully. He stayed aloof, reserved, letting the public project greatness onto him. But behind the scenes, he moved fast. Allies gathered around him: his brother Lucien, an ambitious politician; Talleyrand, the slippery diplomat who could smell power like a wolf scents blood; and Size, one of the Directory's members, who dreamed of reshaping the government. They all agreed, the Directory had to go. To understand the coup that followed, you have to picture France in late 1799. People were exhausted. A decade of revolution had brought liberty, yes, but also terror, executions, wars, and poverty. Farmers wanted stability. Merchants wanted security. Even revolutionaries were tired of the endless chaos. The Directory promised none of it. What France wanted was order, and Napoleon promised order. Not by returning to monarchy, not yet, but by cutting through corruption with the sharpness of a saber. The plan unfolded in November 1799, on the revolutionary calendar. The date was 18 Brumaire, year 8. The Directory would be swept aside, and a new government, headed by 3 consuls, would take its place. Of course, one consul would matter more than the others: Napoleon. It began with deception. Rumors of a Jacobin plot were spread to justify emergency measures. The councils of government were convinced to move out of Paris to St. Cloud, a quieter setting. There, Napoleon's allies prepared the stage. When the moment came, Napoleon marched in with soldiers. He was no polished orator; he stumbled, grew flustered, even shouted angrily when deputies heckled him. At one point, he was physically shoved, nearly fainted, and had to be rescued by grenadiers. The coup was far from a graceful performance. But brute force won where words failed. Lucien, presiding over the Council of 500, dramatically denounced the plots against Napoleon. Soldiers stormed in, driving deputies out at bayonet point. By evening, the Directory was finished. The government of France had fallen, not with elegance, but with boots and muskets. Out of the smoke of Brumaire emerged the consulate. Officially, 3 consuls shared power: Napoleon, Size, and Roger Ducasse. In reality, Napoleon dominated from the start. Size, the supposed mastermind, was outmaneuvered within weeks. Napoleon became first consul, with sweeping authority. It was, in many ways, the end of the French Revolution. Liberty, equality, fraternity, these ideals still lived, but they were now wrapped in order, discipline, and the iron will of one man. The Republic had given birth to a new form of power, not monarchy restored, but dictatorship dressed in revolutionary clothes. How did the French react? With relief. Tired of political bickering, many welcomed Napoleon as the strong hand who could restore stability. The revolution is over, people whispered. And in a sense, it was, at least the chaotic, bloody phase. Napoleon moved quickly to consolidate support. He reformed the tax system, stabilized the currency, and reopened churches shuttered during the revolution. He promised stability without rolling back the great gains of 1789. The nobility would not return, peasants kept their land, and merit, not birth, would decide careers in the new France. To the masses, this was balance. To Napoleon, it was just the beginning. What's striking about Brumaire is how it revealed Napoleon's transformation. He was no longer just the brilliant general who won battles. He was now a political force, capable of toppling governments and shaping constitutions. The boy who had once sulked in Brienne's gardens, mocked as an outsider, now strode at the center of European politics. Still, his ambition wasn't satisfied. The consulate gave him power, yes, but not yet the crown. He would wait, consolidate, reform, and prepare. But already, he was no mere servant of the Republic, he was its master. From Corsican outsider to French general to first consul of France in just 30 years, Napoleon had climbed at breathtaking speed. He had seized France not with ideals but with soldiers, not with votes but with bayonets. And the people, weary of chaos, accepted it. The revolution had opened the door. Now Napoleon had walked through it, carrying not just his sword but the weight of a nation. And soon enough, he would crown himself emperor. By 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte was no longer just first consul of France. He was the beating heart of the nation, the architect of its laws, the commander of its armies, the figure whose very presence promised stability. But stability wasn't enough for him. Napoleon had never been a man content with half measures. From the streets of Ajaccio to the snows of Italy, he had clawed his way upward, and now the question wasn't if he would seize more power, it was when, and in what form. The answer came with a crown. The idea of making Napoleon more than just a consul had been circulating for months. He was already first consul for life, thanks to the plebiscite of 1802. But titles mattered. Symbols mattered. And for a man obsessed with legacy, with comparisons to Caesar and Charlemagne, consul simply wasn't enough. In May 1804, the Senate proclaimed Napoleon Emperor of the French. The wording was careful, not King of France, not Emperor of France, but Emperor of the French. It was a nod to revolutionary principles, suggesting sovereignty came not from divine right, but from the people. Napoleon loved the cleverness of it. He wasn't restoring the Bourbons' throne, he was creating something new. But titles on parchment weren't enough. A coronation was needed, a grand spectacle to dazzle France, silence skeptics, and announce to Europe that a new dynasty had been born. Paris bristled with preparations. The chosen venue was Notre Dame Cathedral, the medieval heart of France's Catholic tradition. Drapes, banners, and garlands transformed the Gothic arches into a stage fit for empire. Painters sketched, musicians rehearsed, and seamstresses stitched uniforms and gowns glittering with embroidery. Napoleon spared no expense. He understood the power of theater, of spectacle. This coronation would be remembered for centuries, he vowed. Every detail mattered. The ceremony was choreographed as carefully as one of his battles. The guest list itself was part of the performance. Europe's monarchs refused to attend, sneering at the upstart Corsican. But Pope Pius VII agreed to come, drawn by promises of reconciliation between France and the Church. It was a coup for Napoleon. What greater legitimacy could there be than a coronation blessed by the Pope himself? Then there was Josephine. She was no longer the young widow Napoleon had married in a whirlwind before his Italian campaign. She was middle-aged now, elegant but insecure, her inability to bear him an heir already straining their marriage. Yet Napoleon needed her by his side. She would be crowned empress, a vital piece of the tableau. Behind the scenes, there was drama. Rumors swirled of her infidelity. Napoleon himself had taken mistresses. Some of his family despised her, particularly his siblings, who saw her as unworthy. But Napoleon insisted. Whatever storms lay ahead, Josephine would stand beside him at Notre Dame. December 2, 1804. The morning was cold, the sky gray, but inside Notre Dame the air shimmered with light from thousands of candles. The cathedral overflowed with dignitaries, senators, generals, bishops, foreign envoys, and curious Parisians craning for a glimpse. Military bands thundered outside, their drums echoing through the city streets. Napoleon entered in robes heavy with gold, laurel wreaths embroidered on the fabric. He walked deliberately, every step rehearsed. Josephine followed, radiant in white silk, her gown sparkling with diamonds. At the altar stood Pope Pius VII, ready to anoint and crown him in the ancient tradition. It was supposed to be the ultimate moment of submission, the Church placing its blessing upon a new emperor. But Napoleon had other plans. As the Pope lifted the crown, Napoleon turned, took it from his hands, and placed it on his own head. Gasps rippled through the cathedral. This was not just a breach of ritual. It was a statement, thunderous and unmistakable. Napoleon was not emperor because the church anointed him. He was emperor because he crowned himself. Authority flowed not from Rome, not from tradition, but from his own will. Then, just as dramatically, he crowned Josephine, lowering the diadem onto her head with a tenderness that masked the tension between them. For that moment, at least, she was his empress. The symbolism was everything. To the French people, it said, here is a leader who owes his power to no one, not to kings, not to priests. He is the revolution's child, but he has risen above it. To Europe, it said, mock him as a Corsican upstart if you wish, but he now sits among monarchs, and on his own terms. Artists captured the scene in paintings, most famously Jacques-Louis David's colossal canvas. It showed Napoleon in glory, Josephine kneeling gracefully, the Pope a quiet witness. The image was propaganda as much as art, burned into memory long after the candles of Notre Dame were snuffed. Not everyone was charmed. Old revolutionaries muttered that liberty had been betrayed, that France had traded one crown for another. Monarchs across Europe snorted in disgust, calling him a parvenu. Even within his family, jealousies simmered. His brothers fumed at Josephine's coronation, feeling she stole a spotlight that belonged to them. But the people? Many cheered. After years of turmoil, they wanted glory, stability, and pride. A crown on Napoleon's head seemed to promise all three. The coronation of December 1804 was more than a ceremony. It was the birth of a new order. The Republic was effectively gone. In its place stood an empire, with Napoleon at its center, radiating both revolutionary legitimacy and imperial majesty. It was theater, yes. It was spectacle, certainly. But behind the robes and candles, it was also cold calculation. Napoleon had shown the world that he was not just France's strongest general or sharpest statesman. He was its monarch, a monarch like no other, self-made, self-crowned, and already looking outward. For Europe, the message was chilling: the age of kings had not ended with the revolution. It had simply been rewritten, and Napoleon was holding the pen. If Napoleon's coronation at Notre Dame crowned him emperor in name, it was his army that crowned him emperor in reality. France could survive without robes and ceremonies. But without the Grande Armée, the Great Army, Napoleon would have been just another ambitious politician. With it, he became the terror of Europe. What made Napoleon's army different? Not just size, though it swelled to nearly 500,000 men at its peak. It was how he organized it. He broke the army into independent corps, miniature armies within the army, each with its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery. A corps could march, fight, and survive on its own for days. Yet when needed, multiple corps could converge with devastating speed, striking like the fingers of a fist suddenly closing. This system made the Grande Armée faster, more flexible, and more lethal than the rigid armies of Europe, which still moved like lumbering blocks, slow to adapt. Napoleon's men could cover 30 miles in a day, live off the land, and fight with ferocity at the end of a long march. His enemies often found themselves overwhelmed before they had time to react. But no army runs on organization alone. Napoleon needed men to command these corps, generals who could act independently yet carry out his vision. He found them among his marshals, a glittering constellation of characters who became both his partners and his rivals. Michel Ney, the bravest of the brave, a fiery red-haired warrior who led charges from the front, saber in hand. Louis Nicolas Davout, stern, disciplined, brilliant, the only marshal who never lost a battle he commanded. Soldiers feared his severity but trusted his genius. Joachim Murat, flamboyant cavalry commander, famous for his extravagant uniforms and reckless courage. He looked like a peacock, but charged like a lion. Jean Lannes, perhaps the most beloved, blunt and loyal, Napoleon's true friend on and off the battlefield. André Messina, nicknamed the darling child of victory, skilled at wringing triumph from chaos. Jean de Dieu Soult, ambitious and capable, though sometimes too political for Napoleon's taste. Each marshal had his flaws: Ney's impulsiveness, Murat's vanity, Massena's greed, but together, they gave Napoleon an instrument no enemy commander could match. He inspired them, bullied them, rewarded them with titles and riches. They quarreled, they schemed, but when Napoleon gave orders, they moved. Napoleon himself was an artilleryman, and he never forgot it. His use of cannon was decisive, not scattered pieces firing at will, but concentrated batteries hammering weak points until they shattered. He once said, "God is on the side with the best artillery." Cavalry, under Murat and others, gave the Grande Armée its shock and speed. They scouted, flanked, and crushed retreating foes. Infantry, drilled and hardened, were the backbone, young conscripts mixed with veterans of Italy and the Revolution. They marched light, carried what they needed, and lived on what they could take from the land. It wasn't a polished army like Britain's redcoats, nor as aristocratic as Austria's ranks. It was rougher, hungrier, more improvisational. But under Napoleon, that hunger became a weapon. What bound the army together wasn't just organization, it was devotion to Napoleon himself. He was more than a general, he was a figure they believed in. He shared their hardships, spoke to them directly, remembered their courage. Before battles, he often rode among the ranks, speaking not in lofty proclamations but in simple words: "Soldiers, you have been hungry and cold. But I will lead you to victory, and you shall have bread and honor." The men cheered him, called him Le Petit Caporal, the little corporal, a reminder that they saw him not as a distant emperor but as one of their own. When he promised glory, they believed. When he pointed toward an enemy, they marched. Napoleon also grasped what many commanders ignored: logistics. He understood that armies marched on their stomachs. He created efficient supply chains, requisitioned from conquered lands, and moved so fast that enemies couldn't cut his lines. His men didn't always eat well, but they moved, and movement itself was a weapon. "The secret of war lies in the legs of the soldiers," he once quipped. And his soldiers' legs carried him to the heights of Europe. By the time of his coronation, the Grande Armée wasn't just an army. It was a legend in motion. Victories in Italy and beyond had given it an aura of invincibility. Soldiers sang songs of triumph, marched under eagles cast in bronze, and believed themselves the chosen instruments of history. That belief was contagious. Enemies often faced Napoleon's troops with dread, convinced they were unbeatable. And in war, morale is half the battle. Napoleon once said he could look at a map for 15 minutes and see the battle unfold in his mind. He treated armies like extensions of himself, moving corps like chess pieces, anticipating enemies' moves before they made them. But the Grande Armée wasn't just a tool, it was his creation, his mirror. Its speed reflected his restless energy. Its adaptability reflected his intellect. Its devotion reflected his charisma. And with this army, Napoleon was ready to test his crown not in Notre Dame, but on the fields of Europe. The first great test would come soon, against a coalition of emperors and kings who thought they could crush the Corsican usurper. They were wrong. By late 1805, Napoleon's empire faced its first great test. Europe's monarchs had been watching the Corsican with growing unease since his coronation. Now they moved against him. Britain, Austria, and Russia formed the Third Coalition, determined to crush the upstart before his power became permanent. To them, Napoleon was not just another French general, he was a virus, a dangerous blend of revolution and monarchy, threatening the old order itself. Napoleon welcomed the challenge. He had his crown, his marshals, and his Grande Armée. Now he would show the world what they could do. Napoleon had initially gathered his army along the English Channel, preparing for an invasion of Britain. He even built barges and drilled troops for a crossing. But when the coalition formed, he pivoted with breathtaking speed. Instead of sailing across the sea, he marched east, a massive shift of hundreds of thousands of men from Boulogne to the heart of Europe. The movement itself was a masterpiece. The Grande Army marched in corps, each able to live off the land, so they didn't clog supply lines. They covered vast distances quickly, converging like streams toward a single river. Austrian forces under General Mack, expecting a slow French advance, were caught off guard. At Ulm, Napoleon encircled the Austrian army with dazzling speed. Mack surrendered with 30,000 men without a major battle. It was victory through maneuver, not slaughter, the kind Napoleon liked best. But the bigger challenge still lay ahead: the Russians. The Russian army, under Tsar Alexander I and General Kutuzov, marched to join the Austrians. Napoleon knew he had to strike before the coalition fully united. In December 1805, his army faced the Allies near a small Moravian town called Austerlitz. The French were outnumbered, 73,000 against nearly 90,000. But Napoleon had the sharper blade, his speed, his marshals, and his uncanny ability to read the battlefield. He deliberately appeared weak. He positioned his right flank on low ground, seemingly vulnerable, and spread rumors that his army was tired and eager for peace. The Allies took the bait. They planned to smash his weak right, roll up his line, and end the campaign in one decisive stroke. Napoleon smiled. He wanted them exactly where they thought they wanted him. The morning of the battle was cold, misty, the ground glittering with frost. Soldiers wrapped themselves in cloaks, breath steaming in the air. Napoleon rode among them, calm, collected, speaking in quiet tones. He later said to his generals, "Gentlemen, examine that sun. It is the sun of Austerlitz." As the fog lifted, the rising sun bathed the fields in golden light. For his soldiers, it felt like an omen. The Allies advanced, pouring men onto Napoleon's right flank, just as he had hoped. His troops held, then gave ground slowly, luring the Russians and Austrians further into the trap. Then Napoleon struck. While the Allies were busy hammering his right, Napoleon unleashed his main attack in the center, where the Pratzen Heights dominated the battlefield. His men surged forward, smashing into the enemy who had thinned their lines there to feed the flank assault. It was devastating. The French broke through, splitting the Allied army in two. Panic rippled through the coalition ranks. Orders collapsed. Soldiers stumbled in confusion as French columns surged like a tide through the breach. Marshal Soult led the decisive charge up the Pratzen Heights. Ney, Lens, Murat, all the marshals moved with precision, hammering stunned Austrians and Russians. Davout, marching his corps over 40 miles in 2 days, arrived just in time to shore up the right flank, completing the trap. By afternoon, the Allied army was shattered. Thousands fled. Some tried to retreat across frozen lakes, only for French artillery to smash the ice beneath them. Men, horses, and cannon sank into icy water, drowning in chaos. The Allies lost nearly 36,000 men, killed, wounded, or captured. The French, barely 9,000. It was one of the most lopsided victories of the age. Napoleon had faced two emperors, Alexander of Russia and Francis of Austria, and destroyed their armies in a single day. The victory was so stunning, so complete, that it was remembered simply as the Battle of the Three Emperors. Napoleon himself was exultant. Riding the battlefield, he told his troops, "Soldiers, I am pleased with you. You have, on this day, justified all that I expected of your courage." He knew what they had accomplished. Austerlitz wasn't just a win, it was the masterpiece of his career. The political fallout was immediate. Austria sued for peace, forced into the humiliating Treaty of Pressburg. The Holy Roman Empire, already tottering, began its collapse. Napoleon reshaped the map, creating client states and crowning allies. His influence spread across Germany and Italy. Britain remained defiant, shielded by its navy, but on the continent, Napoleon looked unstoppable. Austerlitz was proof: the Grande Armée could take on the mightiest coalitions and crush them. Austerlitz entered legend almost instantly. French soldiers spoke of the son of Austerlitz for the rest of their lives, a memory of golden light and invincibility. Napoleon himself never forgot it. Decades later, exiled on St. Helena, he told his companions, "If you want to understand me, study Austerlitz." For in that battle, everything converged: his daring, his deception, his timing, his trust in his marshals, and his soldiers' devotion. It was the perfect expression of Napoleonic war. But perfection rarely lasts. Austerlitz was the summit of his glory, and from summits, the only path left is downward. After Austerlitz in 1805, Napoleon stood at the very summit of his glory. Austria was humbled, Russia driven back, and the map of Central Europe redrawn in French colors. But across the Rhine, another old lion still lurked: Prussia. Prussia had been the soldier's kingdom, the land of Frederick the Great, drilled into Europe's mind as a military powerhouse. Its army marched like clockwork, its officers proud heirs of a legendary tradition. But pride is dangerous when it blinds. In 1806, Prussia, goaded by Britain and Russia, decided to challenge Napoleon. It was a fatal mistake. The Prussian court at Berlin brimmed with bravado. Officers clinked glasses and swore to whip the Corsican. Queen Louise, young and striking, spurred her husband King Frederick William III toward war, urging him not to let Prussia cower while France dominated Europe. But Prussia was living in the past. Its army was still organized and drilled in the rigid style of Frederick the Great, who had died in 1786. 2 decades later, warfare had changed, and Napoleon had changed it most of all. Where the Prussians moved in heavy, precise blocks, the Grande Armée moved like a storm, flexible, fast, unpredictable. October 14, 1806, the day that shattered Prussia's pride. At Jena, Napoleon faced the bulk of the Prussian army. Outnumbered at first, he maneuvered with dazzling speed, concentrating force where it mattered. His marshals, Soult, Ney, and Lannes, hammered the enemy relentlessly. By afternoon, the Prussian lines cracked. Discipline gave way to panic. Napoleon's army surged forward, rolling them up like a carpet. But that wasn't all. Just miles away, at Auerstedt, Marshal Davout, with only 27,000 men, faced nearly 60,000 Prussians under the Duke of Brunswick. By all logic, Davout should have been crushed. Instead, his iron discipline and masterful tactics produced a miracle: he routed them completely. When news of both victories reached Napoleon, even he was astonished. 2 simultaneous triumphs, on the same day, against the once mighty Prussians. It was the death knell of Frederick the Great's legacy. The aftermath was catastrophic. The Prussian army disintegrated. Fortresses surrendered without firing shots. Napoleon's forces marched through Berlin as conquerors. The once proud military state crumbled in weeks, its myth shattered. Napoleon reveled in the triumph. In Berlin, he visited Frederick the Great's tomb. Standing before the sarcophagus, he ordered his marshals to remove their hats, declaring, "If he were alive, we would not be here today." It was a rare nod of respect. Napoleon knew he was destroying not just an army, but a legend. Prussia's collapse didn't end the war. Russia, still part of the coalition, marched west to confront Napoleon. In the winter of 1806-07, the French and Russians clashed in a brutal, bloody campaign across Poland. The Battle of Eylau in February 1807 was unlike Austerlitz or Jena. It was no glittering victory, but a nightmare. Snowstorms blinded men, cavalry charges drowned in blood, entire battalions froze and died where they stood. The French held the field, but at terrible cost: tens of thousands dead, the ground littered with corpses half buried in snow. For the first time, Napoleon felt the chill of a battle that wasn't a triumph but a slaughter. Yet his grip on Europe remained strong. In June, he redeemed Eylau with the decisive victory at Friedland, smashing the Russian army and forcing Tsar Alexander I to negotiate. July 1807. On the Niemen River, near the town of Tilsit, a raft was built. There, in the middle of the water, two emperors met, Napoleon of France and Alexander I of Russia. It was theater, diplomacy staged like drama. The two men embraced, smiling for the world. In private, they carved up Europe. Prussia was gutted, its territory sliced away. Russia and France agreed to spheres of influence. For the moment, they were friends, though neither trusted the other. Napoleon basked in the spectacle. He, the son of Corsican minor nobility, now sat as equal with emperors, redrawing maps as kings trembled. The Treaty of Tilsit marked the peak of his diplomatic power. France was master of Europe, its enemies humbled, its emperor triumphant. But the peace was fragile. Britain still defied him at sea, its blockade choking French trade. Spain simmered with unrest. Russia, though smiling at Tilsit, bristled under French demands. Still, for that brief shining moment, Napoleon stood astride Europe like a colossus. Austria was broken. Prussia was humiliated. Russia was subdued. France's empire stretched from the Pyrenees to the Vistula, from the North Sea to Naples. The boy from Ajaccio, once mocked at Brienne as the little Corsican, had destroyed the armies of Europe's greatest monarchies and forced emperors to meet him on floating rafts like supplicants. The sun of Austerlitz still glowed, and for the rest of Europe, it burned too brightly. By 1807, after the twin storms of Austerlitz and Jena, Auerstedt, Napoleon stood at the zenith of his power. France was no longer a nation on the edge of revolution, it was an empire, vast and gleaming, draped across the map of Europe like a royal cloak. Borders shifted, kings fell, and in their place rose a new order painted in French blue. And at the center of it all sat Napoleon, not merely an emperor of France, but the architect of Europe itself. Napoleon once said, "I make kings as other men make medals." It wasn't just boasting. From 1804 to 1810, he reshaped Europe more thoroughly than any man since Charlemagne. In Italy, he created the Kingdom of Italy, wearing its crown himself, and handed Naples to his flamboyant brother Joseph. In Holland, he placed his brother Louis on the throne. In Spain, a few years later, Joseph would be transplanted there as king, much to the fury of the Spanish people. In Westphalia, a new German kingdom, he crowned his youngest brother Jerome. His sister Elisa became Grand Duchess of Tuscany, and Pauline enjoyed titles of her own. It was a family affair, Bonaparte sprouting like dynastic seedlings across Europe. Blood was the glue of the empire. This wasn't just nepotism. Napoleon genuinely believed family ties could secure his rule. He trusted blood more than nobles or old monarchs. He saw himself as a founder of a dynasty, like the Capets or Habsburgs, planting Bonaparte thrones across Europe that would endure for centuries. Of course, his siblings weren't Napoleon. Some were competent, like Louis, who tried to rule Holland with fairness. Others were disastrous. Joseph never truly controlled Spain, Jerome squandered Westphalia. But Napoleon kept reshuffling his family across the map, convinced he could bend Europe to his will. Germany, fragmented for centuries into hundreds of duchies, bishoprics, and principalities, became one of Napoleon's greatest experiments. After defeating Austria and Prussia, he dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, that ancient and creaking institution, declaring it dead in 1806. In its place, he created the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states bound together under French protection. For centuries, emperors in Vienna had claimed authority over these lands. Now, Napoleon swept the old order aside. German princes bowed to him, signed treaties, and sent soldiers to his armies. France's influence stretched deep into Central Europe, and Austria's prestige collapsed. It was breathtaking. Napoleon had done what centuries of reformers had only dreamed of, he had redrawn Germany in one stroke. To the east, Napoleon played with another old dream, the resurrection of Poland. After the partitions of the late 18th century, Poland had ceased to exist. But in 1807, after defeating Prussia and Russia, Napoleon carved out the Duchy of Warsaw, ruled by the King of Saxony as his ally. To Poles, it was a glimmer of hope, a rebirth of their nation. To Napoleon, it was a strategic buffer, a loyal state between France and Russia. Polish troops fought fiercely for him, believing he would one day restore their full independence. For Napoleon, it was another pawn on his chessboard of Europe. But Napoleon's empire was not just built on thrones and titles. It was built on economics, specifically, his obsession with breaking Britain. Britain, defiant as ever, could not be invaded. The Royal Navy ruled the seas, and Trafalgar in 1805 had crushed French naval hopes. So Napoleon turned to another weapon, trade. In 1806, he declared the Continental System, a blockade forbidding any European state under his control from trading with Britain. Ports were closed, goods seized, smugglers hunted. He believed that by shutting Britain out of Europe's markets, he could starve its economy and force it to its knees. It was a grand experiment in economic warfare, one of the first of its kind. But enforcing it across an entire continent was a nightmare. Smuggling thrived. Britain found new markets overseas. And many Europeans, especially in Spain, Holland, and Germany, resented the blockade, which strangled their own trade more than Britain's. Still, in Napoleon's mind, the continental system was essential. If Europe was French, its economy must be French too, and Britain must be shut out. From Paris, the empire looked magnificent. France commanded not just armies but entire states. The Louvre filled with looted treasures, art and relics from across the continent. French culture, French law, French institutions spread like a tide. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Italians bristled under taxes and conscription. Germans chafed at foreign domination. Spaniards, fiercely independent, would soon erupt in bloody revolt. Napoleon had given Europe order, yes, but it was order enforced by bayonets. Even his family, meant to be the glue of empire, often exasperated him. Louis resisted Napoleon's demands in Holland, caring more for his Dutch subjects than for his brother's system. Jerome lived lavishly, more playboy than king. Napoleon thundered at them in letters, but he could not control their personalities as easily as his marshals on a battlefield. By 1808, Europe looked like a Bonaparte family tree come alive. France dominated directly, allies surrounded her, client states paid tribute. Napoleon's eagles flew from Lisbon to Warsaw, from Hamburg to Naples. He was not just Emperor of the French, he was, in all but name, Emperor of Europe. And yet, the very size of his creation carried danger. Every new conquest added not just territory, but resistance. Every throne he placed under a sibling created resentment among locals. Every attempt to shut Britain out deepened economic pain. For the moment, the empire gleamed, vast and confident, painted in French blue. But cracks were forming in the fresco. And soon, one of those cracks, in Spain, would widen into a wound that never healed. If Austerlitz was Napoleon's sunlit triumph, then Spain was his slow eclipse. It wasn't the largest battlefield he ever faced, nor the deadliest in a single blow. But it was the most draining, a constant hemorrhage of men, money, and morale. What began in 1808 as a confident intervention turned into a grinding war of ambushes, betrayals, and bitterness. Spain had been a French ally of sorts, ruled by the Bourbon dynasty, weak and corrupt but still technically on Napoleon's side. But by 1808, the Bourbon court in Madrid was in chaos. King Charles IV was ineffectual, his son Ferdinand feuding with him, and their royal favorite, Godoy, despised. Napoleon saw opportunity. If he controlled Spain directly, he could tighten the continental system, close the last smuggling ports to Britain, and stretch his empire to the Atlantic. So, with typical boldness, he made his move. He forced the Bourbon king and prince into abdication and installed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as king of Spain. Another Bonaparte throne, another piece of the map turned French blue. Napoleon believed Spaniards would accept it, just as Germans and Italians had. He misjudged badly. On May 2, 1808, Madrid erupted. Citizens, furious at the French occupation, rioted. Armed only with knives, stones, and makeshift weapons, they attacked French troops in the streets. The revolt was crushed with brutal reprisals. Firing squads executed hundreds. Francisco Goya later immortalized the massacre in his haunting painting the 3rd of May 1808, showing terrified civilians facing French muskets in the night. But far from silencing resistance, the blood in Madrid lit a fire. All across Spain, towns rose, peasants grabbed muskets, priests preached resistance. French columns marching through villages found themselves ambushed, harassed, bled. This was something Napoleon hadn't faced before: guerrilla war. The Spanish word guerrilla, little war, entered global vocabulary during this conflict. Bands of peasants, hunters, smugglers, and deserters took to the mountains and forests. They attacked supply lines, assassinated French officers, ambushed convoys, and melted away before regular troops could catch them. The French army, trained for set-piece battles, struggled against shadows. Every village could be a trap. Every ally could be a spy. The cruelty was mutual. Guerrillas tortured French prisoners, and French reprisals were savage. Villages suspected of aiding rebels were burned. Civilians were executed in reprisal. The war turned Iberia into a theater of horror. For the first time, Napoleon's soldiers, those invincible men of Austerlitz and Jena, felt they were drowning in an unwinnable struggle. Into this chaos stepped Britain. Spain gave them the foothold they had long sought on the continent. In 1808, Sir Arthur Wellesley, later the Duke of Wellington, landed with British troops in Portugal. At first, the British presence seemed minor. But Wellesley was no ordinary commander. Cautious, methodical, disciplined, he understood that fighting Napoleon required patience. He fortified positions, used Iberia's rugged terrain to advantage, and forged alliances with Spanish guerrillas. At battles like Vimero and Talavera, British forces held their own. Slowly, steadily, the British presence grew, bleeding Napoleon's resources. Frustrated, Napoleon marched into Spain personally in late 1808. With his presence, the French swept through with terrifying force, retaking Madrid, smashing regular Spanish armies, and pushing the British back toward Portugal. His genius in the field still burned brightly. But Napoleon couldn't stay. Events elsewhere, Austria rising again, threats in Central Europe, dragged him away. He left marshals in command, confident they could finish the job. They couldn't. The Peninsular War dragged on year after year. French marshals squabbled, underestimated the British, and underestimated the guerrillas. Wellington dug in, turning Portugal into a fortress, his lines of Torres Vedras nearly impregnable. French troops, stretched thin and harassed constantly, began to wither. The war drained France of money and men. Between 1808 and 1814, the French lost more than 250,000 soldiers in Spain. Some died in battle, many more in ambushes, disease, or endless skirmishes. For every Spanish town Napoleon's men occupied, another seemed to rise in revolt. And the psychological toll was immense. The invincible Grande Army looked vulnerable. Stories of massacres, atrocities, and endless defeats at the hands of peasants circulated across Europe. The myth of Napoleon's unstoppable machine cracked in the Iberian sun. Perhaps nothing captures the horror of the Peninsular War better than the art of Francisco Goya. His sketches and paintings, The Disasters of War, show peasants shot, women assaulted, bodies mutilated, landscapes filled with corpses. Goya didn't flinch from the brutality on either side. His art gave the world a mirror of what guerrilla war meant: not glory, not banners, but endless suffering. For Napoleon, Spain was not just a military ulcer. It was a moral one. His dream of liberating nations from old monarchies clashed with the reality of a people who saw him not as a liberator, but as an occupier. Napoleon later admitted, "That unfortunate war destroyed me. It was hyperbole, Russia would break him more completely. But Spain was the first slow bleed, the first time his empire seemed not invincible but vulnerable. Even as his armies triumphed elsewhere, at Wagram against Austria, at Friedland against Russia, Spain gnawed at the edges of his strength. The Grande Army could conquer capitals, but it could not extinguish the stubborn fire of guerrillas. And as Europe watched the French bog down in Iberia, rivals took note. Napoleon could be resisted. Napoleon's victories in battle had humbled Austria, shattered Prussia, and even forced Russia to negotiate. By 1807, after the Treaty of Tilsit, he stood as master of the continent. Only one enemy remained untouchable: Britain. The island fortress couldn't be invaded. Trafalgar in 1805 had settled that. Britain's navy ruled the seas, and Napoleon knew it. But if he couldn't beat Britain's ships, maybe he could beat Britain's trade. Britain was, in his words, a nation of shopkeepers. Break the shop, and the empire collapses. Thus began one of the most ambitious and strangest strategies of his career, the continental system. In November 1806, Napoleon issued the Berlin Decree, declaring that all of Europe under his control was closed to British goods. No ships trading with Britain could enter European ports. Smuggling was to be crushed, and even letters from Britain were banned. It was economic warfare on a continental scale. When Russia joined him at Tilsit, he pushed even further, enforcing the blockade across nearly all of Europe, from Spain to Italy, from Holland to Prussia. By 1807, Britain was theoretically sealed out of the entire European market. Napoleon imagined British factories going idle, warehouses filling with unsold goods, unemployment rising, and public anger forcing Britain to its knees. But Britain was not so easily strangled. The Royal Navy patrolled the seas, blockading France's own ports in return. British merchants simply found new markets overseas: South America, the Mediterranean, through smugglers, the Ottoman Empire, India. London's docks stayed busy, its economy adapting to global trade like a chameleon. If anything, Britain's overseas empire cushioned the blow. Far from collapsing, its economy bent but didn't break. The real pain came not for Britain, but for Europe. French allies and client states struggled under the blockade. Merchants in Holland, Germany, and Italy saw trade dry up. Ports stagnated. Smuggling became rampant. Whole towns lived off it, sneaking British goods through neutral ships or along hidden coastlines. Spain and Portugal, heavily reliant on colonial trade, were hit especially hard. When Portugal refused to fully enforce the blockade, Napoleon invaded, dragging himself deeper into the Iberian nightmare. The ulcer of Spain was born partly out of his own economic war. Even loyal allies grew restless. Louis Bonaparte, ruling Holland, complained that enforcing the blockade ruined his people. Napoleon was furious, but Louis had a point. The continental system hurt ordinary Europeans more than it hurt Britain. Russia, too, began to grumble. The blockade strangled its economy, limiting exports of grain, timber, and raw materials. Russian nobles, dependent on trade, grew resentful. Tsar Alexander had smiled at Tilsit, but by 1810 his patience wore thin. To him, the continental system was less about hurting Britain than about keeping Russia dependent on Napoleon's will. This resentment would later help unravel their alliance, with catastrophic consequences for Napoleon. For Napoleon, however, the continental system was more than policy. It became obsession. He micromanaged its enforcement, issuing endless decrees, sending customs officers to root out smugglers, threatening client kings who looked the other way. He poured enormous energy into trying to make Europe self-sufficient, promoting industries like sugar beet farming to replace imported goods. But the harder he pushed, the more resistance grew. The blockade wasn't airtight, it was porous, leaky, mocked by smugglers and weakened by allies. Yet Napoleon clung to it, convinced that economic war was the key to bringing Britain down. The irony is sharp: Napoleon, who won so much through speed and decisive blows, now locked himself into a slow war of attrition that played to Britain's strengths. The nation of shopkeepers adapted. The empire of armies bled itself enforcing rules that its own people hated. The continental system didn't topple Britain. It sowed discontent across Europe, weakened Napoleon's alliances, and dragged him into conflicts, like Portugal, like Russia, that would prove fatal. Napoleon once said, "I am not a man who likes half measures." The continental system proved it. He tried to strangle an island with the weight of a continent. Instead, he strangled his own empire with its contradictions. While his eagles still triumphed on battlefields, his economic war planted seeds of rebellion and betrayal. And as those seeds grew, Britain kept trading, kept financing coalitions, kept waiting. The wars of muskets and cavalry had given Napoleon glory. The war of markets gave him his first real poison. By 1811, Napoleon ruled the largest empire Europe had seen since Rome. From Paris, his reach stretched over Germany, Italy, the Low Countries, much of Spain, and into Poland. His brothers and allies sat on thrones. His marshals commanded armies from Portugal to the Danube. His word redrew borders. And yet, at the height of his power, Napoleon made the decision that would undo it all. He chose to march on Russia. After Tilsit in 1807, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I had embraced like brothers, dividing Europe into spheres of influence. But it was a fragile friendship, one based less on trust than on necessity. The continental system drove a wedge between them. Russia's economy depended heavily on exports of timber, hemp, grain, goods Britain needed. The blockade strangled Russian trade. Smugglers grew rich while nobles fumed. By 1810, Alexander had quietly eased enforcement, reopening Russian ports to British goods. To Napoleon, this was betrayal. If Russia could trade with Britain, the entire blockade collapsed. The continental system, his grand strategy to bring Britain to its knees, would unravel. But there was more. Napoleon's empire and Russia's empire were bound to clash. The Duchy of Warsaw, Napoleon's Polish client state, made Alexander uneasy. Old rivalries over the Balkans simmered. And behind it all, two egos loomed, the French emperor and the Russian Tsar, each unwilling to bend to the other. Napoleon had options. He could have tightened his grip on Central Europe, consolidated Spain, or strengthened his navy. Instead, he convinced himself that only a decisive blow against Russia would secure his empire. If he marched to Moscow, he reasoned, Alexander would have no choice but to sue for peace, just as Austria had after Austerlitz, just as Prussia had after Jena, just as Russia itself had after Friedland. One great battle, one great victory, and the Tsar would bow. But Napoleon misread the Russian soul. The force Napoleon gathered for the invasion was staggering, the Grande Army of 1812, nearly 600,000 men. It was not just Frenchmen. Poles, Italians, Germans, Dutch, Spaniards, Croats, soldiers from across Europe marched under his eagles. It was less an army than an empire on the move. The scale was unprecedented. Supply trains stretched for miles. Tens of thousands of horses carried cavalry, wagons, artillery. Napoleon's confidence soared. He believed no power on earth could resist such a host. But size can be weakness. Feeding, clothing, and moving such an army across vast distances strained logistics to the breaking point. And in Russia, distance itself was a weapon. On June 24, 1812, the Grande Army crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. The campaign had begun. Soldiers cheered, drums rolled, banners waved. Napoleon watched from horseback, calm and determined. But almost immediately, the problems began. The Russians refused to stand and fight. Instead, they retreated deeper into their own land, burning crops and villages behind them. The French advanced, but found only ashes. Supplies dwindled. Horses starved. Desertion began. Napoleon pressed on, convinced that sooner or later the Russians would give battle. He needed his Austerlitz, his Friedland, a single decisive clash. Instead, he found only endless roads, swamps, and heat. That summer was unusually hot. Soldiers collapsed under the sun. Wells ran dry. Disease spread. The invincible Grande Army was bleeding without a battle. By August, the French reached Smolensk. The Russians defended fiercely, then withdrew, torching the city. Napoleon claimed victory, but the enemy escaped again. His frustration mounted. Finally, in September, near the village of Borodino, the Russians stood. It was one of the bloodiest battles of the age. Over 250,000 men clashed in a single day. Cannon roared, musket fire rolled like thunder, charges and countercharges soaked the fields in blood. Napoleon's army won, technically. The Russians withdrew, leaving tens of thousands of corpses. But it was a hollow triumph. His army was mauled, his supplies stretched thin, and still Alexander refused to surrender. 2 weeks later, Napoleon entered Moscow. The ancient capital lay strangely silent. Then, fires erupted across the city. Russians themselves set it ablaze, denying him shelter and supplies. Napoleon waited in the smoking ruins for the Tsar's envoys, certain peace would come. None arrived. Alexander declared he would never capitulate, even if it meant retreating to Siberia. For the first time, Napoleon faced an enemy who would rather burn his own capital than surrender. His strategy, built on the assumption that Russia would behave like Austria or Prussia, collapsed. By October, the situation was desperate. Winter was coming. Supplies were gone. Horses died by the thousands. Napoleon faced the hardest decision of his life: hold Moscow and starve, or retreat. He chose retreat. But retreat in Russia was not escape, it was annihilation. Napoleon later said, "Of all my undertakings, this was the most rash." He wasn't wrong. The road to Moscow was paved with confidence, but it led to ruin. The invasion exposed the limits of his genius, the hubris of believing that one more bold stroke could bend history to his will. The Grande Army had crossed the Niemen as the mightiest force Europe had ever seen. By the time it returned, it would be a ghost of itself. The Grande Army entered Russia in June 1812 with nearly 600,000 men. By October, after Moscow's flames, hunger, and disease, it was already half that. Yet the worst was still ahead. The retreat from Moscow was not simply a military withdrawal. It was a slow-motion collapse, a nightmare of snow, starvation, and death. Napoleon lingered in Moscow too long. Weeks passed after the city burned, waiting for a peace offer that never came. Tsar Alexander refused even to write him. Each day wasted drained supplies and morale. When the first frosts came in mid-October, Napoleon finally gave the order: retreat. He planned to march south, toward Kaluga, to find unspoiled land and supplies. But the Russians blocked him at Maloyaroslavets. After savage fighting, he turned back toward the same road his army had come, the road of ashes, now stalked by winter. The retreat began in late October, under gray skies and biting cold. Already, thousands marched barefoot, their shoes worn to rags. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Wagons had to be abandoned. The Grande Army, once magnificent, became a straggling column of misery. The Russian army shadowed them, striking at flanks, harassing rear guards. Cossack horsemen swooped in like wolves, slashing and vanishing. Each night, campfires grew fewer. At Smolensk, where Napoleon hoped to find supplies, the stores were pitiful. Hunger gnawed the men. They slaughtered dying horses, boiled strips of leather, gnawed bark. Starvation became as deadly as the enemy. In November, the true Russian winter fell. Temperatures plunged below -20 degrees Celsius (-4 degrees Fahrenheit). Snowstorms blinded and buried the columns. Muskets froze, cannon wheels cracked. Soldiers wrapped themselves in rags, stole fur cloaks, anything to fight the cold. Frostbite blackened hands and feet. Men who sat too long by fires never rose again. Bodies lined the road, frozen stiff, staring with glassy eyes. The Grande Army wasn't just retreating. It was disintegrating. By late November, the survivors reached the Berezina River. The bridges were destroyed, the Russians closing in. It looked like total annihilation. Napoleon's engineers worked miracles, throwing together makeshift bridges under fire. For days, soldiers, camp followers, and wagons poured across while Russian guns thundered. Chaos reigned, men crushed, wagons overturned, bodies trampled. Thousands who couldn't cross drowned or were cut down. Yet somehow, miraculously, part of the army escaped. The Berezina was a disaster, but also a testament. Even broken, the French could still fight their way through. By December, the retreat was complete collapse. Fewer than 40,000 remained fit to fight. Hundreds of thousands were dead, from battle, starvation, cold, or capture. The Grande Army had ceased to exist. Napoleon, sensing the political danger back in Paris, left his army secretly and rushed west in a sleigh, racing through the snow to return to France. He left Marshal Murat in command of the ruins. The emperor who had marched into Russia with the mightiest force in Europe now rode alone through the night, a fugitive from his own disaster. Those who staggered back across the Niemen in December were shadows of men. Eyewitnesses described them as living skeletons wrapped in tatters. They had marched for weeks without shoes, their feet raw, their faces gaunt. They spoke of comrades eaten by wolves, of frost so deep men froze mid-step. The Grande Army, once Napoleon's masterpiece, was gone. The catastrophe shook Europe. For the first time, the legend of Napoleon's invincibility shattered. Austria, Prussia, and even wavering allies saw their chance. The emperor who had crowned himself master of Europe now faced a continent ready to rise against him. Napoleon still had brilliance, still had armies to raise. But the spell was broken. Russia was his turning point, the moment when the tide of history shifted against him. Later, on St. Helena, Napoleon admitted, "Of all my campaigns, the one I most regret is Russia. The misfortune of my reign." It was more than misfortune. It was self-destruction. His ambition to enforce the continental system had led him into the vastness of Russia, where winter and stubbornness defeated him more completely than any general. The road to Moscow was glory. The road from Moscow was ruin. When the frozen wreck of the Grande Army stumbled out of Russia in December 1812, Napoleon's empire shook to its core. The man who had crowned himself Emperor of Europe now faced something he hadn't known in a decade: vulnerability. His aura of invincibility, the spell that had cowed monarchs and inspired soldiers, had cracked. And in the courts of Europe, old enemies who had cowered for years began sharpening their swords. Napoleon reached Paris in December, traveling fast in a sleigh, leaving his broken army behind. The speed of his return was itself remarkable. He seemed a figure who could move faster than fate. By the time rumors of disaster reached Paris, the emperor himself was already there, spinning the story. He framed Russia not as a collapse but as a heroic struggle against nature itself. Yes, he admitted, losses were immense. But France was strong, and he would raise new armies. And astonishingly, he did. In early 1813, France called up new levies, drafting boys barely out of school, the Marie-Louises, nicknamed after the empress who signed their decrees in Napoleon's absence. Cannons were recast, uniforms stitched, horses seized. In months, another Grande Army of sorts stood ready. But its veterans were gone, its marshals weary, its cavalry shattered. Napoleon had muscle, but no longer the iron sinews that had carried him to Austerlitz. Meanwhile, Europe stirred. Prussia, humiliated since Jena, saw its chance. In March 1813, it declared war on France, joining Russia. Austria, for the moment, held back, weighing its options. Britain poured gold into the coalition, financing armies. The Sixth Coalition was born, a new league of enemies: Britain, Russia, Prussia, Sweden, and soon Austria. For the first time, Napoleon faced a united continent, not piecemeal opponents. Napoleon moved swiftly into Germany, his instincts still sharp. At Lutzen and Bautzen in May 1813, he struck the Prussians and Russians hard. Both were French victories, but costly ones. Gone were the days when his marshals could sweep the field effortlessly. His green recruits fought bravely, but lacked the discipline of the veterans who had perished in Russia. Still, Napoleon's genius flared. At Lutzen, under cannon fire, he coordinated massive counterattacks that drove the Allies back. At Bautzen, he nearly crushed them altogether. His enemies were reminded, the Corsican was not finished. But his victories lacked the finality of Austerlitz. He could win battles, but not the war. His enemies kept retreating, regrouping, drawing on reserves France could no longer match. Through the summer, diplomacy swirled. Austria, under Chancellor Metternich, offered Napoleon terms: give up parts of his empire, loosen his grip on Germany, and peace could follow. Napoleon refused. Concessions were not in his nature. He believed one more great victory would restore his dominance. Austria decided otherwise. In August 1813, it joined the coalition. The net tightened. Napoleon now faced four great powers at once. In October 1813, near Leipzig in Saxony, the storm broke. The Battle of Leipzig, later called the Battle of Nations, was the largest battle Europe had ever seen up to that point. Over 600,000 soldiers clashed, French against Russians, Prussians, Austrians, and Swedes. For 3 days, Napoleon fought with all his skill. His marshals, Ney, Murat, Marmont, hurled their men against the enemy. The French held their ground at first, inflicting heavy losses. But numbers told. On the third day, the coalition attacked on all sides. Defections from Napoleon's German allies weakened his lines. The French began to crumble. Retreat turned to disaster when a bridge was blown too soon, cutting off part of his army. Thousands were trapped, captured, or drowned in the Elster River. Napoleon barely escaped with the remnants. Leipzig was catastrophic. Over 80,000 French were lost. The Grande Armée was no longer grand. The myth of invincibility was shattered completely. After Leipzig, the empire unraveled. The Confederation of the Rhine dissolved as German states defected. Holland revolted. Italy stirred. Even in France, murmurs grew louder: how long could this go on? Napoleon refused to admit defeat. He retreated west, regrouped, and prepared to defend the soil of France itself. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, enemy armies were marching toward Paris. It's easy to see Napoleon after Leipzig as doomed, but that wasn't how it felt in the moment. He still believed in his star. He still conjured armies from nothing. He still dazzled his marshals with bursts of energy and vision. But the balance had shifted. Europe was learning how to fight him, not by giving battle on his terms, but by uniting, retreating when necessary, and bleeding him with numbers he could not replace. Napoleon had once reshaped Europe with breathtaking speed. Now Europe was reshaping itself against him. The empire trembled, but it had not yet fallen. France herself would be the next battlefield. For over a decade, Napoleon had carried war into other people's lands: Italy, Austria, Prussia, Spain, Poland, Russia. The smoke and blood were always abroad. But in 1814, for the first time, the thunder of cannon rolled across France itself. The hunter had become the hunted, and the French people saw their emperor fighting desperately not for conquest, but for survival. The retreat from Germany after Leipzig in October 1813 was a long, bitter one. Napoleon's once proud Grande Armée was now a skeleton force. German allies defected, Holland rose in revolt, and Austria, Prussia, and Russia pressed hard into France. Britain, too, added its weight. Wellington's army, victorious in Spain, pushed across the Pyrenees into southern France. From every side, enemies converged. The Sixth Coalition had become an iron ring, tightening with each step. Napoleon's empire was collapsing, but he himself, still only 44 years old, was not finished. Back in France, Napoleon performed his old miracle: he conjured an army from the ground. He called up conscripts, the Marie-Louises, young boys barely old enough to shave, named for the Empress Marie-Louise who signed their decrees. They were raw, inexperienced, poorly equipped. But Napoleon drilled them furiously, moved them swiftly, and once again turned weakness into speed. By January 1814, he faced nearly 500,000 enemy troops with barely 70,000 of his own. Yet in the hands of Napoleon, even such odds did not spell certain defeat. The early months of 1814 produced some of Napoleon's most brilliant maneuvers. He darted across the French countryside like a man possessed, striking isolated columns, smashing them before they could unite. At Brienne, La Rothière, Montmirail, Champaubert, battles fought in snow and mud, he showed flashes of his old genius. At Montmirail in February, with perhaps 20,000 men, he defeated 60,000 Russians and Prussians by moving faster, hitting harder, and exploiting every mistake. His soldiers, half boys and half veterans, cheered wildly. The old emperor still had magic. But brilliance could not conquer arithmetic. For every column he crushed, 2 more marched into France. The coalition generals, Blücher, Schwarzenberg, Barclay de Tolly, learned to avoid full confrontation. They wore him down, pressing forward relentlessly, while Napoleon scrambled like a fire brigade captain, dashing from blaze to blaze. By March, the enemy reached the gates of Paris. The city, heart of France, was not just a capital. It was the symbol of the revolution, of the empire, of Napoleon himself. His marshals, Marmont, Mortier, fought valiantly to defend it, but the coalition had overwhelming numbers. Inside the city, panic spread. Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's hapless brother left in charge, fled. The Empress Marie-Louise and the young King of Rome were whisked away. Citizens armed themselves, but the defense was desperate. On March 30, 1814, Paris fell. Russian and Prussian troops marched through the streets, their flags flying where Napoleon's eagles had once soared. For the Parisians, it was surreal: the wars had finally come home. Napoleon was not in Paris when it fell. He was south with his army, still maneuvering, still hoping for a miracle. When news reached him, he was stunned. He had believed his marshals could hold the city. Their surrender, especially by Marmont, felt like betrayal. He retreated to Fontainebleau, the grand palace outside Paris. There, surrounded by dwindling troops, he faced the unthinkable: abdication. On April 6, 1814, under pressure from his marshals and facing the coalition's united demand, Napoleon abdicated the throne. The Emperor of Europe, who had crowned himself in Notre Dame less than a decade earlier, laid down his crown. He wept as he bid farewell to his old guard, those veterans who had marched with him from Italy to Austerlitz, from Madrid to Moscow. At Fontainebleau's courtyard, he embraced them: "Soldiers of my old guard, I bid you farewell. For 20 years I have led you in honor and glory. Be faithful to your new king. Do not grieve for me. I could have died among you, but I will follow the road fate traces for me." Hardened soldiers wept openly. For them, Napoleon was not just a commander, but a father, a legend. The coalition exiled him to Elba, a small island off the coast of Italy. He was given sovereignty over the island, a small guard of 1,000 men, and a pension. It was meant to be a gilded cage, a safe distance from France, but not too far. As he sailed away, Napoleon must have reflected on the speed of his fall. In 1812, he had commanded an army of 500,000 in Russia. In 1814, he was reduced to ruling an island of fishermen. Europe exhaled. The ogre was gone. The kings returned. Louis XVIII, brother of the guillotined Louis XVI, was restored to the throne of France. The Bourbon monarchy was back. But history, like Napoleon himself, was not finished. Elba was not the end. The fall of Paris in 1814 was the first true collapse of Napoleon's empire, but not the last act of his story. He had lost his throne, yes, but not his spirit, not his ambition, not his magnetism. Elba would prove only a pause. Europe thought it had caged him, but Napoleon was already plotting his return. Napoleon's abdication in April 1814 seemed final. Europe's monarchs congratulated themselves, Paris celebrated, and the world believed the Corsican ogre was safely tucked away on the tiny island of Elba. He was given a mock crown, a few hundred guards, and sovereignty over 12,000 islanders. It looked like a retirement, humiliating, but comfortable. But Napoleon Bonaparte was not a man built for exile. On Elba, Napoleon acted as if he still ruled an empire. He reorganized the island's administration, reformed its agriculture, and even drew up plans for roads and schools. He drilled his small guard of 1,000 veterans like a miniature Grande Armée, complete with uniforms and eagle standards. But beneath the bustle, he brooded. Reports from France trickled in. King Louis XVIII, the Bourbon restored, was unpopular. The old monarchy seemed stiff and out of touch. Taxes remained high, soldiers were disbanded, and the people grumbled. Veterans felt betrayed, their sacrifices dismissed. The tricolor flag was gone, replaced by the white of the Bourbons. Napoleon's name still carried weight, in taverns, in barracks, among peasants who remembered bread and glory under his rule. The legend had not died. It had only been smothered, waiting for air. In February 1815, with astonishing boldness, Napoleon escaped. Slipping past British patrols, he sailed from Elba with a tiny flotilla and fewer than 1,200 men. His destination, France. His goal, everything. He landed near Caen on March 1. The gamble was insane. If the French army resisted him, he would be crushed immediately. But Napoleon bet everything on loyalty, on memory, on the bond between him and his soldiers. The march north became one of history's most dramatic journeys. At first, villagers and towns watched warily. Soldiers sent by the king confronted him near Grenoble. Napoleon rode forward alone, dismounted, and threw open his coat. "Soldiers," he called, "if there is one among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." Silence. Then shouts, "Vive l'empereur!" Muskets lowered. Soldiers rushed to embrace him. The king's troops became Napoleon's once again. It was theater, yes, but it was also real. Napoleon had wagered his life on the devotion of men who had marched with him from Italy to Moscow, and they did not fail him. Town after town, regiment after regiment, he won back. No shots fired, no blood spilled, just cheers, tears, and memories. The eagle, his symbol, soared again. As Napoleon advanced, Paris trembled. Louis XVIII panicked, realizing his throne rested on paper, not on bayonets. He fled the capital. The government collapsed in confusion. On March 20, 1815, Napoleon entered Paris to thunderous applause. The streets erupted with shouts of "Vive l'Empereur!" The tricolor flag flew once more. In just 20 days, with barely more than words, Napoleon had reclaimed France. But Europe had not forgiven, and it had not forgotten. The moment Napoleon returned, the coalition powers declared him an outlaw. Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain pledged to unite once more to destroy him. Napoleon knew the odds. He had returned not to build a lasting empire, but to gamble everything on one final campaign. He reformed the government, rallied the army, and promised peace if Europe would let him keep his throne. Europe would not. And so began the 100 Days, a brief, breathtaking sprint of hope, defiance, and looming doom. Napoleon later said, "My true glory is not to have won 40 battles, for Waterloo will erase the memory of as many victories. But what will live forever is my civil code." He already sensed his return was fragile. Yet for a moment, in that spring of 1815, the eagle soared again. From Elba's cage, he had broken free, raised an army without firing a shot, and once more stood at the head of France. It was the most astonishing comeback in history. But every flight ends in descent, and this one would end on the muddy fields of Belgium. When Napoleon strode back into Paris in March 1815, the city roared as if 1812's disaster and 1814's defeat had never happened. But Europe was not cheering. Within days, the crowned heads of Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Britain branded him an outlaw. The peace of the world, they declared, rests upon his destruction. The 100 Days had begun, and all paths led to a final battlefield. Napoleon wasted no time. He knew Europe would mobilize faster than ever before. The coalition armies were already gathering, British forces under the Duke of Wellington in Belgium, Prussians under Blücher nearby, Austrians and Russians marching but still far away. If Napoleon waited, the enemies would converge on France. His only chance was to move first, strike fast, and shatter the coalition before it united. So he raised an army of about 125,000 men, smaller than his old Grande Army, but hardened by loyalty and desperation. He drilled them relentlessly, reminding them that they were the same soldiers who had triumphed at Austerlitz, Jena, and Wagram. And then, in June 1815, he marched north toward Belgium. Napoleon's plan was classic: divide and conquer. He struck first at the Prussians, defeating them at Ligny on June 16. But he did not destroy them completely. Blücher, battered but unbroken, pulled back, promising Wellington he would return. At the same time, Napoleon's left wing under Marshal Ney clashed with Wellington at Quatre Bras. It was a bloody stalemate, but it delayed Napoleon's forces and gave Wellington precious time to organize his defense. The stage was set for June 18, near a small Belgian village called Waterloo. The ground was a farmer's landscape, rolling ridges, muddy fields, farmhouses turned into fortresses. Overnight rain had turned the fields into sodden muck. Cannonballs would plow into the mud and stick, musket fire would hang in the damp air. For cavalry, for artillery, the ground itself was an enemy. Wellington chose his position well, arraying 68,000 Anglo-Dutch and Allied troops along the ridge. Napoleon commanded about 72,000, with Ney and Soult as marshals. The Prussians, somewhere in the distance, were marching, and everything depended on when, or if, they would arrive. Napoleon delayed his attack until late morning, waiting for the ground to dry so his artillery could be effective. That delay, hours lost, proved costly. Blücher and the Prussians used the time to march toward the battlefield. The French opened with a massive artillery bombardment, the cannons thundering across the fields. Then, infantry surged toward the Allied center at Hougoumont, a farmhouse turned fortress. Hougoumont became a battle within the battle. French troops hurled themselves against its walls all day, but Wellington's men held. Later, Wellington said, the success of the battle turned upon the closing of the gates at Hougoumont. Meanwhile, Ney led repeated cavalry charges against the British lines. Thousands of horsemen thundered up the muddy slope, sabers flashing, plumes waving. But the British infantry stood in squares, bristling hedgehogs of bayonets. Charge after charge broke against them, horses and men falling in heaps. Ney, reckless as ever, led from the front, but the charges bled French strength. By late afternoon, Napoleon launched his main assault. The Imperial Guard, his most elite troops, veterans of a dozen campaigns, marched up the ridge. The Guard advances. French soldiers cried. It was the hammer blow meant to crush Wellington once and for all. But the Guard met fierce resistance. Musket fire tore through their ranks. British and Allied troops, battered all day, summoned their last reserves. In the smoke and chaos, the Guard wavered. Then, to shock and disbelief, they broke. "The Guard retreats," someone shouted. The word spread like wildfire. Panic swept the French lines. Soldiers who had fought since dawn now fled in chaos. At the same time, Blücher's Prussians finally arrived on Napoleon's right flank. Fresh troops crashed into the exhausted French. The trap Napoleon had always sprung on others now closed on him. By evening, the French army was in full rout. Napoleon himself tried to rally them, but even the old guard could not hold. Defeat was total. Napoleon escaped the battlefield, his cloak spattered with mud, his face grim. He had fought one of the bloodiest battles of his career, nearly 50,000 dead or wounded between both sides, and lost everything. In Paris, he abdicated once more, this time for good. He hoped to flee to America, to start a new life. Instead, the British captured him. Unlike Elba, there would be no easy island nearby. This time, they sent him to the remote rock of St. Helena, far in the South Atlantic. Waterloo became more than a place. It became a symbol, of hubris, of downfall, of the moment when Europe finally broke Napoleon's spell. For the French, it was grief and bitterness. For Britain, it was triumph, sealing Wellington's fame. For the rest of Europe, it was relief. The long nightmare of Napoleonic war was finally over. Napoleon himself later said, "Waterloo will erase the memory of my 40 victories." Yet even in defeat, his legend endured. The mud of Belgium could not bury his name. After Waterloo, Europe did not make the same mistake twice. Elba had been too close, too lenient, too easy an escape. This time, the victors chose exile so remote, so harsh, that no comeback could ever be staged. The island was called St. Helena, a volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, thousands of miles from Europe, Africa, or the Americas. Windswept, barren, surrounded by cliffs and rough seas, it was a prison no man could escape. Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, Master of Europe, arrived there in October 1815. He would never leave. Captured aboard the British ship Bellerophon, Napoleon became a curious spectacle on the voyage. Crowds in Plymouth and Torbay gathered in boats to catch a glimpse of him through the cabin windows. Some jeered, others stared in awe. To them, he was both monster and marvel, the man who had shaken Europe now reduced to a prisoner. On the long voyage south, Napoleon read, walked the deck, and spoke with officers. But when the coastline of St. Helena appeared, jagged cliffs rising from endless ocean, he knew this was no mere detention. It was burial alive. His residence, Longwood House, was a damp, drafty building perched on a windswept plateau. Rain seeped through the walls, mold crept across the ceilings, and the surrounding land was bleak scrubland. Gone were the palaces of Paris, the grandeur of Tuileries, the splendor of Fontainebleau. Here was an emperor's cage. A British garrison of thousands watched him constantly. He could not walk beyond a certain limit without escort. Letters were censored. He was treated not as a statesman, but as a dangerous captive. Napoleon was not entirely alone. A handful of loyal companions followed him into exile: General Bertrand, his devoted aide; General Montholon, another loyal follower; Countess Marie Waluska's son, occasionally sent to him; and most famously, Emmanuel de Las Cases, who recorded conversations that became the memoirs of St. Helena. These men and their families formed his tiny court, addressing him as Emperor, preserving dignity amid humiliation. Napoleon's days on St. Helena followed a strict, melancholy routine. He rose late, took long baths, sometimes 2 hours or more, dictated memoirs, played chess, and strolled the gardens. He read voraciously, Plutarch, Caesar, Tacitus, Homer. He studied history not as pastime, but as battlefield, determined to shape how posterity would judge him. Food was poor, the climate oppressive. He grew heavy, then sickly. But his mind remained restless. He argued endlessly with his companions, replaying his battles, justifying his decisions, lamenting betrayals. On St. Helena, Napoleon fought a new kind of war, for his reputation. He dictated endlessly, crafting the narrative of his life. In his version, he was not a tyrant or warmonger, but a hero of the revolution, a man who spread merit, law, and progress across Europe. He painted himself as the liberator of nations, not their conqueror. "The future will judge me," he said, "not these English jailers." And indeed, his words, carried back to Europe, began to inspire sympathy. To liberals, he became a symbol of progress crushed by reactionary kings. To romantics, he was the lonely titan, Prometheus chained on a rock. By the late 1810s, Napoleon's health worsened. He suffered from stomach pains, weakness, and depression. The dampness of Longwood gnawed at him. Some say he was slowly poisoned, others that cancer, the disease that killed his father, took him. The once tireless general, who had ridden across Europe with boundless energy, now shuffled weakly through gardens, wrapped in heavy coats against the chill. His world had shrunk to a handful of rooms and the memories in his mind. On May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, Napoleon Bonaparte died. His last words, whispered weakly, were, "France, Armée, tête d'armée." Josephine, France, Army, head of the army. Josephine. He died as he had lived, thinking of France, his soldiers, and his first great love. He was buried on St. Helena, in a simple grave, under a weeping willow. His tomb bore no name, only, "Here lies." The British refused to inscribe Napoleon. St. Helena was meant to erase him, to confine him to obscurity. Yet it did the opposite. His exile transformed him from a fallen emperor into a legend. Visitors who saw him remembered not the conqueror, but the tragic figure pacing a barren island, a giant chained by fate. And across Europe, whispers grew, perhaps Napoleon was right. Perhaps kings had crushed not a tyrant, but the embodiment of modernity. By 1820, Napoleon's body had begun to betray him. The once tireless general who had marched armies across Europe was now bloated, pale, and plagued by constant stomach pains. He slept poorly, sweated through fevers, and often complained of the gnawing inside. The lonely rock of St. Helena was becoming his last battlefield, and his own body the final enemy. Longwood House, damp and moldy, did his health no favors. Rain seeped through the ceilings, mildew clung to the walls, and the air was perpetually heavy. He developed chronic hepatitis symptoms, ulcers, and weakness. Napoleon had long feared stomach cancer, his father had died from it, and the symptoms seemed similar. Some later suspected he was poisoned, pointing to arsenic found in hair samples centuries later. But whether poison or cancer, the result was the same: Napoleon was dying. In his last year, Napoleon withdrew further into himself. He stopped taking long walks, too weak to climb the hills. He read less, dictated less, and lay in bed for hours. His face grew puffed, his skin waxen. His companions worried, but the British governor, Hudson Lowe, remained cold, treating him as a prisoner first and a dying man second. Yet even in weakness, Napoleon's pride endured. He continued to call himself the Emperor, continued to wear his uniform on occasion, continued to dictate his memoirs, polishing the legend he knew would outlast him. By April 1821, he could barely rise from bed. Doctors bickered over his treatment, prescribing purgatives, bleedings, and tonics, none effective. He drifted in and out of consciousness, mumbling of battles long past. Witnesses recalled him whispering orders as if still commanding troops: "Form the line, attack, cavalry to the right." He thought often of France. "I want my ashes to rest on the banks of the Seine," he said, "in the midst of the French people I loved so well. On May 5, 1821, a storm raged over St. Helena. Napoleon, delirious, murmured his last words, France, Armée, tête d'armée. Josephine, France, Army, head of the army. Josephine. At 5:49 p.m., the Emperor of the French breathed his last. He was 51 years old. An autopsy was performed by French and British doctors. The official report declared stomach cancer the cause of death, with a large ulcer perforating his stomach lining. Others whispered of poison, claiming Britain wanted him quietly removed. Still others thought the arsenic traces might have come from dyes in the wallpaper of Longwood House. The debates have never ended, keeping his death as mysterious as his life was dramatic. Napoleon was buried on the island in a valley he had admired, shaded by willows. The French wanted his tomb marked with Napoleon. The British refused, fearing the power of his name. The compromise was strange and stark. His grave bore no name at all. The stone read only, "Here lies." A silence, an absence, as if even in death he unsettled them. News of his death traveled slowly, reaching Europe months later. For monarchs, it was a sigh of relief. For ordinary people, it was something else. Across France, veterans wept, peasants whispered prayers, and liberals spoke of him not as tyrant but as fallen hero. In England, some even felt a guilty admiration, writing poems of the man who had fought them for 20 years. In death, Napoleon became safer. No longer a threat, he could be remembered as a legend. Napoleon himself had predicted it. On St. Helena, he once told a companion, "Jesus Christ was killed at 33. I shall die before 50. And yet, who shall control the world's imagination, him or me?" It was vanity, but also prophecy. For even as his body decayed beneath St. Helena's willows, his story was only beginning. The man was dead. The myth was alive. For nearly 20 years after his death in 1821, Napoleon lay in a nameless grave on St. Helena. His enemies thought time and distance would erase him, that the rock in the Atlantic would swallow the memory of his empire. But it didn't. In France, the legend of Napoleon only grew. Veterans told their children of the campaigns, students whispered of him as a hero, and artists painted him as a tragic Prometheus chained by jealous kings. By the 1830s, Napoleon's name had become once again too powerful to ignore. And France, divided, restless, searching for identity, began to call for his return. In 1830, the July Revolution toppled the Bourbon monarchy once more and placed Louis-Philippe, the citizen king, on the throne. To strengthen his legitimacy, Louis-Philippe sought symbols that could unite France. Who better than Napoleon, the man who, whatever else he had been, embodied French glory? In 1840, after long negotiations, Britain agreed. Napoleon's remains would be returned to France. For Louis-Philippe, it was political theater. The ashes of the emperor would sanctify his regime. For the French people, it was vindication. A French frigate, the Belle Poule, painted black with silver trim, was sent to St. Helena. Commanded by the young Prince de Joinville, son of Louis-Philippe, the ship carried officers, veterans, and priests. On October 15, 1840, the anniversary of Napoleon's arrival on St. Helena, the grave was opened. Witnesses wept as the coffin was lifted, draped in imperial purple, and carried aboard the frigate. The voyage back was solemn, ceremonial, as if carrying not just bones, but a nation's soul. On December 15, 1840, Paris erupted. The Seine glistened with torchlight, streets thronged with people. Arches and banners proclaimed, "Napoleon, le Grand." The funeral procession wound through the city, past cheering crowds, lined with veterans in faded uniforms who saluted with trembling hands. Cannons roared, bells tolled, and the cry of "Vive l'Empereur" echoed as if he still lived. The coffin, carried on a gilded carriage shaped like a Roman chariot, moved slowly toward its final resting place, the Hôtel des Invalides, the great domed church built by Louis XIV for France's veterans. Napoleon's new tomb was designed to impress. Under the Golden Dome, in a circular crypt, his sarcophagus would lie surrounded by sculpted victories and inscriptions of his greatest achievements. It was not just burial, it was sanctification. His body, once denied even a name on St. Helena, now rested at the very heart of Paris, beneath marble and gold, honored as one of France's greatest sons. The retour des cendres, the return of the ashes, was more than ceremony. It transformed Napoleon from divisive figure into national icon. To conservatives, he was a tyrant who brought chaos; to liberals, he was a reformer who embodied the revolution's ideals. But in 1840, he became something larger, the very spirit of French greatness, the man who had lifted the nation to heights it had never known. Victor Hugo, who witnessed the return, wrote, "He is finished with exile, finished with solitude, finished with dreams. Here he is, returned among us, the Emperor of Glory, the Emperor of Memory." Since that day, Napoleon has never left France again. His tomb at Les Invalides remains one of Paris's most visited sites, a place where history, legend, and myth blur. Schoolchildren stand in awe at the vast sarcophagus. Veterans salute in silence. Tourists whisper as if before an altar. The man who had died on a lonely rock, nameless under a willow, was reborn in marble, gold, and national memory. Napoleon once said, "There is only one step from the sublime to the ridiculous." His life proved it: meteoric rise, catastrophic fall, lonely death. But in death, he leapt back to the sublime. The return of his ashes was not just the end of exile. It was the final victory of his legend. Napoleon Bonaparte died in 1821, but in truth, he never really left. His body rests under the Golden Dome of Les Invalides in Paris, but his name, his image, his legend, those belong to the world. Few figures in history have left so deep a mark, and fewer still continue to stir such fascination, such debate, such awe. Napoleon himself once predicted it: "My true glory is not to have won 40 battles, but to have created the civil code." The Napoleonic Code, written in 1804, remains one of the most influential legal systems in history. It enshrined equality before the law, property rights, secular authority, and the abolition of feudal privileges. From France, it spread across Europe and beyond, to Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, parts of Germany, Poland, even Louisiana in the United States. In this, Napoleon's legacy endures not in battlefields but in law courts, in everyday life, in the way modern societies define justice. Yet law alone doesn't explain why his shadow is so long. Napoleon remains etched into memory because he was the soldier who embodied an age. He rose from obscurity, a Corsican outsider mocked for his accent, to master of Europe. He fought 60 battles, won nearly all of them, and reshaped nations by the force of will and imagination. He could be ruthless, vain, domineering. But he could also be magnetic, inspiring, even tender. Soldiers marched into hell for him, women adored him, enemies both loathed and admired him. His energy was volcanic, his confidence boundless. Part of why Napoleon endures is that he contains contradictions. He was a child of the revolution, yet crowned himself emperor. He claimed to spread liberty, yet ruled as an autocrat. He gave Europe law, but drowned it in war. He was both the great reformer and the great destroyer. And in those contradictions, people see reflections of humanity itself: ambition, brilliance, hubris, tragedy. By the 19th century, poets and artists had transformed him into myth. To Victor Hugo, he was a fallen titan. To Byron, a tragic hero. To Delacroix and David, a figure bathed in light, astride rearing horses, cloak billowing like destiny itself. Even in defeat, he fascinated. Especially in defeat. St. Helena, with its lonely exile, gave him the aura of martyrdom. He was no longer just a general, he was a man punished for daring too much, a modern Prometheus chained by kings who feared him. Politicians, too, lived in his shadow. His nephew, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, rode the legend to become Emperor Napoleon III in 1852. Others invoked him as symbol of French strength, of national pride, of the revolution's promise. Even today, debates rage: was he a tyrant or a liberator? A visionary or a monster? A Caesar reborn or merely an ambitious soldier who overreached? The answer is yes, to all of it. Napoleon's influence was not confined to France. In Germany, his conquests stirred nationalism, planting seeds that would one day unite the country. In Italy, his campaigns ignited dreams of independence. In Latin America, revolutionaries like Bolívar looked to him as proof that empires could be broken. Britain, his great nemesis, defined much of its 19th-century identity in opposition to him. And even in Russia, his invasion, though a catastrophe, left a mythic imprint of resistance that became part of its national soul. Walk through Paris today, and his presence lingers. His tomb beneath Les Invalides, massive and solemn, draws pilgrims. His portraits hang in museums across the world. His name adorns streets, monuments, ships. Even his hat, that iconic bicorn, instantly conjures his image. And in popular culture, he never left. Novels, operas, films, even video games, Napoleon remains alive as symbol, character, archetype. A shorthand for ambition, for brilliance, for the rise and fall of greatness. Napoleon endures because his story is, at its core, a human epic. It has everything: the rise, the unknown outsider climbing to dizzying heights. The triumphs, battles won, crowns seized, an empire built. The hubris, overreach, pride, the march into Russia. The fall, exile, defeat, Waterloo. The tragedy, the lonely death on St. Helena. It is Shakespearean, biblical, timeless. In the end, Napoleon became more than man. He became myth. His name is shorthand for genius and arrogance, glory and ruin. He is admired, hated, studied, imitated, but never forgotten. From Corsica to Moscow, from Paris to St. Helena, his life traced the arc of a comet, brilliant, blinding, and gone too soon. But unlike a comet, he left behind not darkness, but a glow that history cannot extinguish. Napoleon Bonaparte, soldier, emperor, exile, legend.